I'm pretty sure when it comes to finding a rape culture somewhere in this world, a lot of my fellow citizens would probably all start searching at the same place. But I think that as much as recent events might point to that, it would be maybe even wrong to suggest that we imported something that could be called a rape culture, or that what happened in recent months here could be considered to be a rape culture, an imported rape culture. Let me explain. The word rape culture, as used by the modern-day third-wave feminist and the regressive left in general, defines a society in which rape is just a regular, normal part of daily life, as something that is not really seen as a crime, but a mere normality. Of course, the suggestion of this being the current state within our Western societies is just purely ridiculous. The law is very clear on this. Rapists are not exactly treated as normal members of the community. In fact, our society has wide-ranging disgust and disdain for sex offenders. But what I am interested in is not the rape culture myth of the West itself, but to examine if there really is a rape culture somewhere in the world, beyond the West. I am sure many of you in the wake of the Cologne attacks have heard the phrase imported rape culture, asserting that the Middle East has a rape culture as if it were a given undeniable fact. I don't buy into assertions on first glance and have spent some time ever since Cologne looking into the Middle East for a while to try and find an actual rape culture in some Middle Eastern society. I am pretty certain that a lot of you watch the Honey Badger radio podcast, and in a recent stream of theirs with Habib as a guest, Karen made the point that the argument of saying feminists should go to the Middle East because there is a real rape culture there is somewhat flawed. I oppose feminism because it is an authoritarian ideology and not because I want to deport it to the Middle East. Neither am I willing to use the feminist line of thought when examining the Middle East to come to a conclusion on what might be wrong there. There is something fundamentally wrong in the Middle East that has led to sexual assaults being extremely common throughout it. But is that really due to a rape culture? Wouldn't that be a simplistic conclusion along the lines of how the people we oppose would categorize things? I, for one, am in favor of taking a closer look at what is going on and carefully analyzing what are the causes for this, rather than making a superficial statement based on assertions. Think of this. The overwhelming majority of all men in the Middle East suffer from genital mutilation, and in some Middle Eastern countries, FGM is also very widespread, such as in Egypt, where over 90% of all women have mutilated genitalia. The practice of genital mutilation inflicted on both men and women originates out of nothing else but an ancient religious superstition and hatred of sex, and the pleasure one can get out of sex. It's the result of religious, prudish, Puritan zealotry. The foreskin contains sensitive nerve endings that, when the foreskin is pulled back, are stimulated, producing a sensation that raises sexual pleasure. Similar to that, female genital mutilation involves the removal of the clitoris and the cutting up and sewing together of the labia, obviously with the intent of limiting the amount of sexual pleasure the woman can have. And this Puritan attitude of decrying and condemning sexuality as something fundamentally evil and dirty is generally widespread throughout the Middle East. Since in most Middle Eastern nations the ruling authorities are religious authorities and laws come from God, the Puritan hatred of sex is preached from the top and deeply ingrained within society, with preachers proclaiming that women who wear too little deserve to be raped, and that people who have what would be considered to be a healthy sex life are possessed by demons or some other bullshit and therefore have to be outcasts of society or even punished. Think of a nation filled with sexually frustrated people who have been mutilated specifically to be inhibited in their ability to gain pleasure out of their sexuality, and who are constantly being told that sex itself is an inherently evil and disgusting thing, and that they should be ashamed every time they might even dare to think about engaging in such a crime. Is it a stretch of the imagination to assert that this toxic climate is the main contributor to what is causing the high number of sexual assaults in Middle Eastern societies? Sex is a natural drive and not something inherently evil. It's as natural as eating and drinking, and no matter how hard you will try to suppress your sex drive, sooner or later it will have to come out. In fact, suppressing your sexuality is probably the more harmful thing to do. I remember a case I read about a few years ago of a orthodox, fanatically religious family that vehemently refused to have their children take part in the school system due to the sex education courses, homeschooled their children, and vehemently tried to keep every single reference about sex away from their children. In the end, however, their children ended up having sex with each other. Conclusion: if you don't build a healthy relationship with your sexuality, you will build an unhealthy, harmful one, which is extremely sinister. Now imagine that taking place on a grand social scale within an entire nation. The feminist ideological concept of rape culture asserts that rape and sexual assault become a normal part of daily life within society due to misogyny, due to a social hatred of women that is perpetuated and promoted by men, and supposedly also promoted by power structures that favor men and are kept in place by men. I argue, however, the big number of sexual assaults in the Middle Eastern Islamic societies is due to a hatred of sex, perpetuated and promoted by religious zealots. As such, I think it is fair to claim that what is happening in the Middle East is not a rape culture, but a Puritan culture, or a sexually frustrated culture. Rape, even in the Middle East, is not seen as something good, commendable, or socially acceptable. Rape in Islamic societies is still considered to be a crime, but due to the warped and broken social structures that have been put in place by the Islamic authorities, it is more common, and also due to the hatred of everything that has to do with sexuality in general, it is possibly even less condemned as it should be. Think of what happened in Cologne. In essence, there was a steady stream of crime until the crowd of Middle Eastern migrants noticed that the police was not in control over the situation and couldn't arrest the assailants. And when the crowd noticed that, they could get away with it. Chaos broke out, with up to 60 sexual assaults taking place within 30 minutes. These are not, in my opinion, the actions of people who think rape is a normal and acceptable thing. And in my opinion, these are not the actions of a rape culture, but the actions of a society that has been broken and poisoned by religious zealots to an extent that even the sex lives of the individuals within that society have been completely deranged and broken. Let's move on, and let me give you the most extreme example coming out of the Middle East when I looked through its stats on sexual assault and rape. The rape of young boys in Central Asia. Bachabazi, which some of you may have heard when reading about Afghanistan, is the practice of hiring an underaged boy, dressing him up flamboyantly, having him dance for a group of men, and then having that boy raped by those men. Because you may have read about it happening a lot in Afghanistan, you may think of it as an Afghan practice, but the phrase Bachabazi itself is Farsi, which is a Persian language. This cultural practice is Persian and Turkmen in origin and not limited to Afghanistan, but was present throughout Central Asia. But the rape of young dancing boys is a practice that has been present in that region since long before Islam. It dates back to antiquity. It is hard to imagine, but essentially the rape of young boys was essentially a part of the cultural framework of these societies, just as dancing in lederhosen is part of Bavarian culture. It was almost removed out of these societies under colonial Imperial British and Imperial Russian rule. It is, as far as I've read, non-existent now in the Central Asian former republics, Soviet republics of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, but is still widespread in Afghanistan and is extremely common in the non-Central Asian country of Pakistan, where this practice was essentially imported to. In Afghanistan, the rape of boys is some kind of sick privilege that is limited to tribal chiefs and people with high social status who get to rape boys. In Pakistan, the situation is incredibly worse, with the rape of young boys being a common thing, especially in the northeast of the country. Essentially, in Pakistan, when a truck driver takes a break at a hostel during a long trip, he can go and rape a boy at that hostel. There is a rape epidemic in Pakistan, with underage boys being the main victims. There are up to 4 million homeless street children, street boys, in Pakistan, and estimates put it at 90% of these boys having experienced rape during one point in their life. A survey on 1,800 Pakistani men, yes, I know it is a small sample, revealed that 1/3 of them believed that the rape of young boys is acceptable. Here we have an actual cultural practice of rape being made acceptable in society. The difference to the feminist concept of rape culture, however, is that this practice is not furthered by some nebulous hatred of boys, but by an ancient and barbaric cultural set of practices. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned before, this hideous practice was on the decline throughout most of the 20th century and seems to have only recently appeared with the increasing Islamization that took place especially in Afghanistan and Pakistan during the 1980s and 1990s under the Taliban and Zia al-Haq. Islam being an inherently reactionary force, furthering notions of going back to traditional values, back to the basics and other such nonsense, I wouldn't be surprised if this cultural practice was revitalized by the zealot clerics you will find in the mosques and madrasas from Islamabad to Kabul. The question I pose is, if there is something that could be called or considered to be a rape culture, I would have to say that after looking through the Middle East, this so far is the only thing where I would feel comfortable of calling it an actual rape culture. Or do you believe that the Middle East in general, with its twisted and broken Puritan relationship with sexuality, can be seen as such? I'd say no, because it would be an oversimplification. What say you?